Thank you very much, Pam, for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation to speak today. And I'd like to welcome back some of you who were here last week when we had to break because of the fire, and to welcome those who weren't in attendance last week but have joined us today. And again, thank you for taking time out of your summer schedule to listen to me talk about a topic that's becoming increasingly the focus of my future research, and that is on historical and contemporary archaeology in Greece. What I want to do today is to introduce you to the field of historical archaeology, give you a little bit about its background and its relevance or its salience to the study of the Eastern Mediterranean and the greater Greek world. So I'll begin by talking about what historical archaeology is and isn't, what constitutes it, and then why it's beginning to develop and why it's really been a field that has really taken off in the last 2 decades. And then I'll talk about, again, its relevance to our part of the world. I'll then talk about some of the content, the themes that structure historical archaeology, as well as deal with some of the controversies that it has entailed. I'll then turn and give you some case studies that allow us to track how the field is developing in the Greek world over the last few decades. The quote you see on the left there from 2010 came from Charles Orser, who's one of the leading historical archaeologists in the world, and who periodically has taken a leadership role in assessing how the field has been developing over time. And he opined in 2010 how the field had been taking off and it really had exploded since the 2000s, and that it had made substantial strides that were showing how the relevance of the study of the recent past, including the archaeological record of the recent past, could help us to understand the present and implicates the future as well. Let me say that if I do not mention your work, it's because I have had, of course, to be selective in the number of case studies due to time constraints. So I'll talk then about some case studies from our part of the world that allow us again to track how the field has been developing. And then I'll end by looking at the 2 most important things, perhaps. What are the challenges that face the development of the field going forward, and what I see as its prospects? But let's begin by looking at what exactly is historical archaeology. Well, historical archaeology is a phrase that primarily comes from North America, a field of archaeology that developed in North America. And we'll see in a minute that what constitutes the field is been controversial and continues to be. However, the development of historical archaeology in North America cannot be separated from the development of the field of post-medieval archaeology in Europe. The two were founded approximately the same time. The Society for Post-Medieval Archaeology, which had previously been the Society for the Study of Post-Medieval Ceramics, was established in 1966 in the UK. And the first issue of the journal, Postmodern Archaeology, appeared in 1967. Well, only 4 months after the official establishment of the Society for Post-Medieval Archaeology in the US, in Dallas, a group of archaeologists gathered to establish a society for the study of post-contact, post-1500 America. And so in January of 1967, the Society of Historical Archaeology was formed. Now, these 2 fields developed in parallel for the first really 3 decades of their existence. The 2 fields did not have much contact, but we will see that will change. So historical archaeology then developed in America, and it was seen as referring to the period in North America or in the Americas after Columbian contact. And historical archaeology then had the connotation, and it was explicit, as was part in America, that it was to distinguish from, quote, prehistoric. In other words, that the study of societies that were, quote, literate, or we say can we study with the aid of texts, started to take shape. But then again, with the connotation being that it distinguished the period before European contact and colonization and what came afterward. And so from the beginning, very origins, there was this tension within historical archaeology as to what exactly it referred to. From the start, and then continuing into the 2000s, most recently iterated by John Moreland in his 2000 book, seen here on the right, Archaeology and Text. I should point out, as I go through the lecture, what I've tried to do is to give you some guides to future for the reading, because I'm not sure how you're familiar with the field. So I've put what I consider some of the more seminal pieces. So for example, the best assessment of the history of historical archaeology was published in 2020 by Adam Fraccia in the volume, The Routledge Handbook of Global Historical Archaeology. But now back to Moreland. Moreland in the 2003 really encapsulates and summarizes what had been one school of thought, one side in the argument, which was this, is that historical archaeology referred to the study of all societies which we could study with the aid of texts, which left historical records. So that meant that historical archaeology was this huge, almost all-encompassing field. And so its definition, its boundary definition then remained extremely fluid. So for example, this classical archaeology, a subfield of historical archaeology, Egyptian archaeology, Ming China. Now, at one level, one could say yes, because that is indeed text-dated archaeology. On the other hand, though, is it just sufficient that we have text to aid us in our archaeological inquiries? When we think of all of the variables that make these different societies distinct, how it takes them out of time, place, historical context. So the field then, construed this way, was really this massive encompassing field. But there were those who argued that what made it important was it drew a black line, a red line rather, between prehistoric archaeology and historical archaeology. Now, the other side, there were those who argued that historical archaeology had a very precise meaning, and that it referred to the archaeology of the world from 1500 to the present. So historical then refers to a historical period and not historical sources or the writing of history with archaeology together, right? So historical archaeology meant a specific time, and in its initial formulation, it meant a specific place, the Americas. And if you look at, for example, the publications in the first two and a half decades of both post-medieval archaeology and the journal Historical Archaeology, one finds that until the 80s, post-medieval archaeology published works on Britain, and historical archaeology published works on North America. That would begin to change. Now, it really is in the 90s when it starts, we see a real shift. And again, Orser is pushing this. What he formulated was that what we were really talking about then was archaeology of the modern world. And we're going to talk more about what is the content of historical archaeology. And we'll see that it highlighted the major variables, the major thematic areas that shaped how the modern world has developed. Let's turn to that now. So in 1996 then, in the publication Historical Archaeology of the Modern World, which was an anthology that brought together some of the leading scholars of the world, Orser formalized the content of historical archaeology as focusing on four broad topical areas: history of capitalism, colonialism, Eurocentrism, and modernity. These variables were also the ones that were the foundation and created the framework for post-medieval archaeology in Europe. And so formulated this way then, post-medieval in Europe and historical from North America really come more together. Controversy remained, or arguments still remained, particularly about the question of modernity. And the more it was debated, the more those who followed the Orser camp came to see modernity less as a discrete variable and more as a label. And so in a 2014 publication, a primer on modern world archaeology, Orser offered a new formula and a way out of the impasse of the debate. And that was to ditch historical and call it modern world archaeology. Couldn't get more dramatic, couldn't more plain in advertising what it was. And replacing then modernity as one of the key constituent themes, he introduced racialization. So he argued then this is a field that we should now change to call modern world archaeology, which made clear once and for all that the field focused on the period of the recent past. Okay. Now the two down below are my readings of things, how I have approached it. I have tinkered with, and I have problems with the formulation it also had. And in my formulation, capitalism, colonialism remain as key constituent variables, as they must. But instead of Eurocentrism, I conceive it more as looking at a process of, in this historical period, historical archaeology as Eurocentric globalization. That we're looking at the process we're looking at is global connectivity in which European cultures and societies and powers play a central role. Replacing racializations, I find that too restrictive a term. Of course, the formulation, the invention of race is very much a phenomenon of the modern world and a key negative prop of it. But racialization only refers to one type of identity process. So I want to introduce a broader category that I'll just simply call identity. Now I'm going to turn to another debate in a moment that has emerged as the field has matured. As everybody who has reviewed the field over the last 2 decades opines, and you'll see the quote from Fracha on the previous page, is if the field started to take off in the 2000s, it exploded in the 2010s. So much so that it became clear that they were starting to emerge, I don't want to say subfields, but divisions in this broad vision of historical archaeology. One which increasingly became called contemporary archaeology. And here's how I see the content of contemporary archaeology. It's a shift from the study of tracing capitalism to consumerism, from the colonial to the post-colonial. Identity remains, but again, the content of that will be different. And instead of Eurocentric globalization, I see in the contemporary world what I'm going to call integrative globalization. If you're wondering, that picture in the mural I put on there because it seems to me to capture the themes, particularly we see at the top. Capitalism, you can see the way they're dressed, the fact that there's the chocolates, etc. Capitalism, the production, the Eurocentrism, you can see in the dress, etc. So these then are the major themes which undergird the fields. But as I said, as the field has matured and the publication record has become larger and the field of study has expanded, there's been now tension between the study of the really recent past, what's becoming called the contemporary, and what comes before, i.e. before the mid-20th century, back to 1500. For some, argue that there is one coherent field of historical archaeology we've talked about, but that is divided now, we have to divide it into 2 subfields. One we maybe call the modern and the other contemporary. And you'll see why these terms have particular sense when we look at the chronological framework used by modern Greek historians. Underneath that are just some of these subfields that provide the content for both modern and contemporary, and they overlap, of course. There's landscape archaeology of the contemporary world, as well as industrial archaeology, and etc. So we get then is one field with one major chronological division, breaking that into 2 fields. And that, of course, the development of historical archaeology is connected to the recent development of environmental archaeology and environmental history, not just in Greece, but elsewhere as well. A second formulation, however, sees historical archaeology and contemporary archaeology as being so different in scope, content, and in some extent even methodology, that they need to be seen as separate fields. So even though they share all of these different subfields, there is, some would argue, a sufficient difference between the two that that distinction should be formally recognized, and we see them as two fields. Sorry. My own opinion, my own view, I accept this one. This is the scheme that I feel most comfortable with at the moment. As I should say, this is work in progress. So that's been the development of these fields, or two fields. And what I want to look to now is to shift and look at how work within the greater Greek world, the great Eastern Mediterranean, has been developing as these simultaneous shifts have been occurring in the broader fields themselves. Well, one of the most exciting developments of the last 2 decades, in my view, has been the emergence of a historical archaeology of the Ottoman Empire. The field really takes coherence with the publication in the early 2000s of this edited volume by Uzi Baram and Linda Carroll. And the field has picked up from there. There are 2 really good recent assessments that I would recommend you read. One by Ioanita Vroom, as you can see, from 2020, and another one by Elias Golavos and Athanas Vionis that came out in 2019. Vroom's piece is historical archaeology in the Eastern Mediterranean and Middle East, again, a review of the field. Golavos and Vionis, entitled theirs, Ottoman Archaeology in Greece, a New Research Field. Before talking about the coverage, notice how, even though she calls it historical archaeology, Vroom wants to see it as a new academic discipline. And Golavos and Vionis make clear that they see it as a research field. I don't agree. I think that, in my view, I think the initial formulation by Baram and Carroll is still the most precise. That what we're looking at is the historical archaeology of the empire. Turning Ottoman into an adjective of Ottoman archaeology raises the question, well, what does that describe? Is it chronological, the period, the span of the Ottoman Empire? Is it geographical, covering the Ottoman Empire itself, which of course is changing over time? Seems to me that Ottoman archaeology is historical archaeology, and that the Ottoman refers to place. And that's going to accommodate the shifting borders as newly created states, successionist states out of the Ottoman Empire, create their own national archaeologies. Nonetheless, whatever you want to call it, this historical archaeology of the Ottoman Empire has made significant strides over the last 2 decades, which again, it's going to be, we'll see more detail, and I'll present some case studies. Now, there is one issue that really is central for us to work out moving forward, and that is chronology. One of the reasons why there's been, I don't want to say an impediment, but there's certainly been some barriers that have prohibited as much integration, much collaboration between modern Greek historians and Greek archaeologists. And one is certainly is chronology. In Greek archaeology of the medieval, we find various terms that are used: late Byzantine, Frankish, Phoenician, Latin, and Ottoman, and you see labeled as modern. Well, these categories, again, can be somewhat elusive because they are very site-specific, area-specific, time-specific, and idiosyncratic. They're sort of sub-periods to larger entities. What we find in historical archaeology of the Eastern Mediterranean, as you can see, using these terms, you get early modern, which really refers to the 15th through the late 18th in historical archaeology, modern, which would be the late 18th to the mid-20th, and then contemporary to the present. That formulation fits more closely to how Greek historians divide the historical periods of Greek history of the post-medieval period, which is early modern from 1453 to 1774, the modern from 1774 to 1950, and then contemporary 1950 to the present. So certainly one thing that has to be sorted out, and we need greater dialogue with our historian colleagues, is the chronologies that we will use, so that we will be speaking in a language that, the same language. So this is one of the impediments. Nonetheless, what I want to focus on for the rest of the time is recent developments, and as it were, the good news of what's been going on. I think one of the boom areas of the study of the historical archaeology in the Greek world has been ceramic studies. Our understanding of almost all aspects of chronology, style, regions, etc., has developed by leaps and bounds since, say, the 1990s. I've picked the work of two people who I consider to be two of the leaders in the field, Ionita Vroom, and I could fill up the entire screen of this slide and a couple more with her publications. So I just picked on some of the more prominent ones, particularly her books, which are foundational for our understanding of ceramics of the more recent periods. Also the work of Nikos Liaros. Nikos is the archaeologist at the Museum for the Study of Modern Pottery, and himself has published substantially. Again, I'll point you to just three of his pieces. One of the best pieces to assess how the study of pottery has developed by projection is this one that appeared recently in the Journal of Greek Archaeology, the 2020 issue. He's also got a great, very long piece on the archaeology of 19th century kilns, which ties to this new book that has just come out by Peace, Yangoplastikitis Skeas. You see here just a chart that I put up there. You see that that's been compiled showing the various regional styles, etc. So our study then of modern ceramics has gone to a new level. And what it's beginning to get is exactly coherence of a subfield itself. There is a very vibrant group on Mediterranean ceramics on Facebook, and then there's another one that is based that Nikos established through the museum. Both of these are invaluable resources as people contribute stories, posts about, for example, pots from different area, pottery from different area, kilns that have found, all kinds of information about modern ceramics. And again, you can check out this Facebook group here, which again has been proven itself to be an invaluable resource. Our understanding of not just fine painted ware, but of coarse wares has also moved leaps and bounds back from the days when essentially it's thought that we couldn't do much with plain wares, and so they often, particularly in reports from large-scale archaeological surveys, they were lumped together and just called modern. We're now able, of course, to identify down to regional styles, shapes, etc. And so our study of the material culture and ceramic material culture has developed then greatly over the last 2 decades and shows every sign of being more vibrant as we move forward. This would have made more sense last week when I was going to remind you to, if you were able to attend the 5th Festival Academikis that was taking place at the museum last weekend. I hope some of you did have a chance to go to it. Each year, the museum puts on one of these festivals, and each year they're a great event. So ceramic studies of the post-medieval world, of historical archaeology, has been then one of the major bright spots. One of the best presentations of the potentiality of historical archaeology, in this case coming from a single excavation, is from the report of the massive volume that's come out about the excavation and restoration of the Bayley House in Chalkis on Evia. Originally built in the 13th century, from then on, it continued to be one of the central foci of the city of Chalkis, at various times serving as Venetian, and then has Ottoman administrative headquarters. After independence, it became the seat of the national government for periods until the building went into disrepair, nearly collapsed, until it was restored through a massive, expensive, but wonderfully done restoration of the building that included excavations. The restoration and excavation took place between 2011 and 2017 and consisted of 12 trenches at various points inside the building. And here you see them labeled for you here. Some of the trenches went down to 3.5 meters, others to 1.5 meters. They discovered that underneath there were 4 major strata encompassing 5 cultural periods and 3 chronological: late medieval, modern, and contemporary. The excavation produced large numbers of artifacts, including a physician's kit. You can see it here, physician's tools that had been buried, that the excavators have shown that was buried and then not recovered after the 1688 bombing of the city by the Venetians. What I love about the book by Kondoyanis and Skartsis, and you'll read more about my love of the book when my review of it will appear in the Journal of Modern Greek Studies. In addition to being an excavation report, it also talks about the restoration of the building, timbers, dendrochronology, etc. So it is one of, if not the best, archaeological publications of a modern period site. And it shows the potentiality of excavating modern period buildings. Most importantly, in some ways, was that we have nice stratigraphy with lots of easily identifiable, datable, decorated pottery. You see here, some polychrome Malayoka pottery, but also found alongside them was utilitarian, undecorated plainwares. And what we find is that indeed the plainwares change over time. And so having that stratigraphy with dated material alongside these coarsewares allows us to begin to start to put a chronological sequencing to courseware pottery like this baking dish that you see here. Bayley history also produced large numbers of coins, other types of artifacts, which allow us to trace the cultural history of the building over time. The restoration itself, again, shows how through the different periods, first as Venetian, then from 1457 onward, under the Ottomans, until 1832, when Chalkis became part of newly independent Greece. It's restored to how it looked as a government building in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, and here you see the back of it there. So the Bayley House shows the great potential for excavating and analyzing in detail recent modern period buildings. I'll just touch on this one because it's a project that I'm involved with. I can go into it more if people want. But this project is called Kasha, the Keflanian Andros Historical Archaeology and Social History Project. As the name suggests, it explicitly was bringing together historical archaeology and, in this case, social history. The goal is to combine all of the different types of sources we have: material culture, in this case also detailed studies of the landscape, reconstruction of the landscape, field wall systems, etc., along with the rich textual materials that are available from both Andros and Keflana to try to write a total history. The project covers from the early 16th century, when the island was conquered, up to the basically to the Second World War and the Greek Civil War, when much of the island was abandoned, creating the skeletal landscape of deserted villages, which are providing our main source to this point for explanation. So the project then will combine archaeology, I'm anticipating household archaeology, landscape studies with text-based history, but also as an integral component, study of the environment. So these then are the core, as it were, methodological, and these are the larger issues that we're trying to examine, to capture. One is, what impact did the imperial encounter, not just once, but multiple times, have on the historical trajectory of both islands? In the case of Keflania, of course, Venetian, Andros, Ottoman. Well, also, so these then are areas then that are integrated into empires as peripheral, and yet in many ways they're also central. Andros by its location, Kefalonia by its place in the Adriatic. We're also looking at the economic relation, as at various times both of these islands were integrated into global economies, both in terms of products and people. They were both multi-denominational societies, so we're looking at that included people of different religions, different ethnicities, etc. So we're looking at how this multi-denominational society developed in the context of these areas as well. A key part will be looking at how societies responded to ecological and environmental change. Our study begins at the advent of the Little Ice Age and then continues after the Little Ice Age ends. So we capture then both slightly before the Little Ice Age, what impact the Little Ice Age has on the island, and then post. Andros and to a lesser extent Kefalonia are both on the cusp of microenvironmental zones, making them particularly sensitive to climate change or environmental change. And of course, as islands connected to these broader networks, we're looking at transnational flows and modalities. Well, so far there's been 2 field seasons and 2 archive seasons. The field system, in the field systems, we focused on the northern part of the island, and we selected a series of abandoned households and villages to study. We used aerial photography to reconstruct field wall systems. You can see on this side to the left. And then we zoomed in on specific households and their attendant field systems. Using field walking and high definition satellite photography, we were looking at what the terracing systems, how it was on them, etc. And then also we focused on a select number of households. Obviously we recorded them, etc. And then under the conditions we were allowed to work, we were allowed to clean the floors of extant buildings. And this, of course, provided a lot of materials. In one case, we found an entire cache of tools from a closet that had fallen over. Now, the archival side is we are able to relate and put people into these various households and track that down to the individual level, but certainly at a more macro level, we can actually reconstruct who was villages, taxes, etc. We have land leases, we have agreements, and so we can actually now put the human side and combine that with the material culture to look at the dynamic shifting of this countryside over time. Next summer, if we're able to, we're going to continue working on field systems and selected farms and villages in the north, but we're also going to be examining in detail 2 pottery workshops that have been identified. So this type of research then shows how we can take the model of the large regional-based projects that our colleagues working in earlier periods have developed and adopt that framework to study the more recent period. And of course, we've got a great resource for doing so across Greece, and that is deserted villages. The Greek countryside is littered with villages that are no longer occupied. And even though their presence has been known for decades, they really have not become the focus of much of detailed research until recent times. Before really the 2000s, deserted villages were only looked at as a source for trying to create the demographic history of earlier times. And the first major study was by Antoniadis Bebikou here from 1965, which again was interested more in demographics than using deserted villages as archaeological sites for the study of society and culture. In more recent times, however, that has changed. As I just mentioned, and here you see two examples. Here is some of the farming from the village of Ayos Damas that we worked on, but also one of the many water mills in the region that are extant. And this one river ravine system that we walked, we recorded 23 separate water mills. Some of them, this is the one that we actually cleaned, just great detail. So deserted villages then are scattered everywhere. But it's only recently they've been looked at as sources for historical research. The best way to get up with what's going on is this volume that appeared in just last year, edited by Rebecca Seifert and Deborah Brown, Deborah Brown Stewart perspectives. And here you see the table of contents over here. Deserted villages, for the most part, as I said, it was studied for demographic, and then they were studied more for what we want to say folklore, or for almost recording, as it were, a visual record of the past. And a really good book that shows that approach of seeing these deserted villages as sort of snapshots into the material and culture and life of the past is this volume by Yorgos Kyriakopoulos, The Archaeology of Yesterday, Ruined Houses and Farmsteads in the Aegean. It's available in Greek as well. And it is a fantastic book that presents Yorgos's photographs from his visits to deserted villages and farmsteads across the Aegean. The photographs, largely accompanied by any text or analysis, to show the wealth of materials that are available in these houses. He himself does not analyze the materials from these houses, but records them. The next step forward in the deserted village, and we see it exemplified in some of the essays in the Deserted Villages volume, is to see them as archaeological sites on par with sites from the past and treated in the same way and given the same care. To see them, as it were, as sources for landscape archaeology, and rather than just as these abandoned remnants, these skeletal remnants of the more recent past. So deserted villages and the wealth of them in Greece gives us a resource on which historical archaeology in Greece can really develop. So those give you some sense of some of the projects and some of the approaches that are exemplified in what we're calling historical archaeology in Greece. Now, turning to the more contemporary, there's far fewer studies, as one might imagine. So here is the framework that I presented earlier that I've employed: consumerism, integrated globalization, identity, post-colonial. But I also see some additional themes that make the contemporary more complex. One is urbanism. Well, of course, cities have been around for millennia. Really, the second half of the 20th century and the 21st century looked at globally. And that has been the trend in historical archaeology, as you've seen, is to focus on the global, to go from the micro to the macro, from the regional and the local to the global. And I see in the second half of the 20th century, the process being more of integrative globalization, but I said urbanism. Cities globally developed in size, scope, and complexity in ways in the second half of the 20th century than they ever have before. And yet this has been largely ignored in our study of material cultures or contemporary archaeology. Other field that is, I think, integral of contemporary archaeology, and that is the study of heritage and memory. Two subfields that are integral or closely connected to contemporary archaeology are the archaeology confinement, internment, and industrial archaeology. On the left here, I've given some literature and guides to some of the key issues involving contemporary archaeology. It's really only in the middle part of the 20-teens that it becomes a separate field. It's also at that time, as you can see from the top essay on the right, number 1, by McCatigny and Penrose, that it's only in 2016 that we get a forced formalization that contemporary archaeology is part of post-medieval, right, and should be seen as it, but it's exactly this time that post-medieval archaeology comes increasingly to see itself as coming under the rubric of historical archaeology. So for example, in looking at the contemporary world in terms of publication and historical world, from 2016 on, the journal Post-Medieval Archaeology every year posted a review of the literature in post-medieval / historical archaeology in the globe. And so post-medieval and historical have become integrated at the same time that we're distinguishing historical from contemporary. And again, here are some of the argument, some in literature that will give you another aspect on it. Now, another tack that's been taken for those who see the Anthropocene as beginning at the end of the Second World War into the nuclear age, contemporary archaeology then for them is the archaeology of the Anthropocene. So let's look at what work in contemporary archaeology has been done in Greece. Well, this is far less underdeveloped than work on earlier period. But I'll focus on a couple of areas where there have been substantial developments. And one of the most important has been the archaeology of internment. And here again are some examples of the recent work on Greece. The illustration in the middle comes from Kostis Korellis' publication from 2019, in which he was looking at, as it says, the landscape of the camps found that were established in Thessalia. And looking at, in this case, he's looking at the spatial organization of the camps, how it was changes over time, etc. So basically an archaeology of refugeehood or refugee camps has emerged in the last 2 decades as the refugee issue has ramped up in Greece. So there have been a number of studies, for example, that have focused on camps, in this case, the Moria camp on Lesbos. There's been other publications that look at the material culture that is being produced and utilized by these refugees in the camps, etc. So the study then of internment in Greece as really emerging as one of the constitutive fields of contemporary archaeology. And while I didn't list comparative materials here for you, there is a rich body of literature on the archaeology of internment elsewhere around the world. And so we've got here again a source, a great source that is available within Greece that can provide us with greater insights and understanding into contemporary developments, social history, as it were, of refugee populations. But we can also contextualize it into this emerging field around the world. So the archaeology of internment. Conflict archaeology is another one that is gaining some traction, although again, still in its infancy in Greece. The material that has been done is mostly focused on the 20th century, World War I, and the Balkan Wars. So for example, here you see trenches that were dug during the campaign in Gallipoli. Gallipoli has been the site of a number of major excavations and work, as has the Macedonia front, with this great volume that was published by the British School, which I would strongly recommend people begin with. If you want to get a grip on the general development of conflict archaeology, this now somewhat dated piece from the Journal of Archaeological Research can give some guidance there. Just to show you some of the resources that are available, you find littered around Greece remnants and, as it were, remains from Balkan Wars, the Greek Civil War, Second World War. So for example, here you see German pillboxes from Glyfada, where the Germans had set up guns to protect the harbor, etc. These litter the area around here. Found scattered across Greece. In this piece here, we see border fortifications from Epirus that was studied by Dimitris Papadopoulos. Here you see a photograph from of the trenches that were excavated, etc. But it's not just material remains from this more recent past that we look at. An archaeology of conflict archaeology can also encompass earlier periods. So for example, some work that I've been doing is on battlefields in the camps from the 1897 Greek-Ottoman War, where we have detailed maps from the military showing us not just the battlefields and formations, but where the camps were, resources were. And so here we have an opportunity to combine textual evidence, accounts from officers, from others who participated in the war, looking at camps, to camp life, etc. And what conflict archaeology has shown us, conflicting elsewhere, has shown us is that there is the possibility of indeed a very rich historical archaeological record from battlefields, camps, and certainly there are some studies that have been done, some publications in the US that have shown that the archaeological data forced us to rewrite the history of a campaign and its battles. So conflict archaeology in Greece has great potential. Here again, the ability to combine the textual and the archaeological, and in this case, also oral history, a sort of ethnohistory of battle. Industrial archaeology is a field that has great potential, so far untapped in Greece. You'll find very few publications that directly talk about the field itself. The only one of the few that I know of is back in the 80s. What we do have is studies of specific industries, mostly from the textual record, but that combines some material remains, but the material remains mostly were illustrative and not used for analyses. Nonetheless, there is a very, very rich untapped archaeological record for industrial archaeology. And its potential is best seen on Facebook with this group. The Vault of Industrial Digital Archives, we used to be called the Industrial Archaeology of Greece site. Now it's been reformatted, but what it is a site at which people have been uploading photographs and material from industrial remains from around the country. And these include small workshops like this to industrial factory floors, and not just in the Athens Piraeus, but elsewhere around the country, there are abandoned factories, workshops, some of them that are in a state that machinery is still on the workplace floor. And here again, with these, we have the ability to combine state records, official records, economic records, bank records, a more ethnographic element in terms of oral history or historical ethnography of workers. And so what we have then are untapped resources. But nonetheless, industrial archaeology, I would argue, has a great potential to develop in Greece. Let me introduce you to a very recent study, a relatively recent study that I think provides a model of historical archaeology, how archaeology can be done. It's this book here, Captives, Colonists, and Craftspeople, Material Culture and Institutional Power in Malta, 1600 to 1900, by Russ Palmer. Russ basically took the historical archaeology framework and then turned it into research realms of research questions. In this case, looking at taking the colonization and saying, well, how can we concretely analyze the colonial? He did so by examining institutional agents and spaces, prisons, schools, other official spaces where the space and identity where it comes together. To study capitalism, he focused on the local economy, labor in particular, but foodways, using again the material record and the textual record available from Malta to reconstruct these. Identity. And here you have an imperial counter that brings together not just Brits and Maltese, but people from all around the world. Malta was truly this melting place, making identity a key issue, and as well as global interactions. Through excavations, for example, in the prison that were done under the auspices of the Maltese government, but he was also able to do selective excavations himself in other buildings, orphan hospital, etc. He constructed, for the first time, we have an actual ceramic sequence from modern Malta, but he also shows us the richest of potentiality. The excavation, for example, of the British officers' quarters is revising completely our understanding of the life of the British military, but also interaction with local community. Shows how Malta was integrated not just into economically, not just into Mediterranean, but in fact a global economy. So, for example, beer from Canada appearing in the mess of the officers, etc. So Palmer's book shows us how those macro themes can be converted into discrete research areas. And then he shows the richness, how using the rich record of archaeological and textual remains, in this case from Malta, can allow us to revise completely the social, economic, cultural history of the region. In closing, let me lay out what I see as the challenges. Well, there are challenges to us specifically and challenges to the field itself, the field of historical and the fields of historical and contemporary archaeology. One is we have to deal with scale. If we're going to see historical and contemporary archaeology at a global scale, we have to then relate. It has to be multiscalar. We have to be able to relate the micro, the farmhouse, the factory, the village, the neighborhood to the macro. Representation. There are those who again, I would agree that the field is still too Eurocentric. We have to overcome the historical baggage that basically rooted the study of historical periods into North America and just core Europe, and make it much more complex. But lastly, and it's been emphasized by many, is that we have to survive, to flourish more, to establish an even greater, as it were, institutional presence. Historical and contemporary archaeology have to show their relevance to the contemporary world, which I think both can do. So here I see are the challenges before us for Greek historical and contemporary archaeology. One is, again, treating recent period remains as real archaeological sites. And that means defining criteria to determine what counts, what distinguishes, what are the ones that, what counts a site. Because we want to see one of the problems we have is a superabundance of materials. I would argue that wherever possible with modern period remains, that one, if possible, to excavate or certainly to clean the floors of buildings, etc., to take them down to foundational levels and start to create databases of material in a chronological sequence. You'll see why in just a second. And that's because we really do not have comparative collections of material cultural remains for dating, for identifying during the modern periods. For tools, for basic elements of material culture. We have rich collections in museum. Most of them are poorly dated. They're taken out of context. So what we need then is studies of the museum collections, but to turn them into evidence of human activities and not just as pieces to be admired for their artistic merit, but to see them as social and cultural. And then wherever possible, to place them into chronological sequences that will allow us to get a better handle on change over time. There also needs to be greater dialogue and collaboration between historical archaeologists and modern Greek historians. This is occurring particularly as these two fields, economic and environmental history, are taking off. Each has their own historical professional association, I should say, as we are developing for historical and contemporary archaeology in Greece. So again, greater collaboration and participation with our colleagues who are doing more economic environmental. How do we turn these massive amounts of data on these Facebook compilations into usable databases? And then the problem we have with the modern archaeological landscape is the superabundance of materials. How do we study them? When you've got a village of, say, 25 farmhouse complexes, that each of which is standing in itself could be worthy of study. So the utilizing then newer technologies that will allow us to cost effectively study large numbers of remains. A key question in terms of the archaeological landscape going forward is preservation. One of the key aspects of modern contemporary archaeology is a form of rescue archaeology, and that is preserving, at least in recording, these deserted villages and other areas that will soon be gone. And of course, one of the big challenges for any new field is funding. Where monies, particularly in our case, where classical archaeology and early period archaeology remains so prominent, is the struggle for dollars. Historical and contemporary archaeology also do not have a great presence institutionally, which we need to work on. But in spite of these challenges, I remain very optimistic. What I see over the last decade is the fields of historical and contemporary archaeology in Greece taking off. We see that in some of the studies that I've talked about today. The Bayley House excavations, the deserted villages volume, Thanos Vianis's volume on the Aegean, one here. An article appealed recent Journal of Field Archaeology, again, elevating the visibility of our field of modern period archaeology, in this case from the Archaeology. Arriving soon on our bookshelves will be this volume, the early modern Zagori of Northwestern Greece by Phaidon Midopoulos Athanasiou. According to Amazon, my copy will be here on August the 6th. And those of you who had the pleasure to listen to him speak as part of this lecture series earlier in the year can see the great potential to the work he's doing. So what I then see in these and then of course, this recent volume, which interrogates archaeology in the contemporary context, which again brings us to another part of historical and contemporary archaeology, and that is it is inseparable from the political, social development of the modern world, in this case, in terms of the field itself. Also, I love in this volume showing how the past, the present, and the future are all implicated in our venture in studying more recent period archaeology. So what I see then are signs of fields that are really taking off, that however are facing, I think, some of the confrontations of early adolescence as we try to find our way forward. But in closing then, I see great potential for the development of historical and contemporary archaeology in the Greek world. And with that, I'll close and I'll be glad to answer questions or talk more or in discussion with you more about the fields developing. As I said, this is preliminary work for me. And so this is a work in progress. And so I'd love to hear people's ideas as well. So thanks very much.